Well, I really appreciate the invitation to be a part of this conference today, and I want to thank Matt for really putting together a great program. I've enjoyed listening to today's presentations as well. And I will just introduce myself, Kevin Smith, University of Minnesota. I'm a professor in the Department of Agronomy and Plant Genetics. I'll also start with an apology. I am not a farmer or an extension researcher. I'm a plant breeder. So you're going to hear a lot less of this really great practical real world insight and information that you've heard from a lot of the day's previous viewers, and you'll hear a little bit more on the research side, and hopefully I'll tell you a little bit about why I think winter barley has a future in Minnesota and the upper Midwest. But before I do that, I'll just say that I've been at the university for 23 years now, and all of that time I have worked on breeding malting barley. So our program has been around for over 100 years with a long time focus on spring 6-row malting barley. And that's where it was when I started 23 years ago. About 10 years ago, I really started to diversify the breeding program in general. We started to do breeding for 2-row barley, for winter barley, which you'll hear about today. And more recently, I restarted our oat breeding program. So we've been working on oats. And then I'm also involved with a really exciting domestication project of developing a new crop, which we're calling Silflower, which is derived from a plant species called Silphium integrifolium. It's a native prairie plant in the middle part of the US. And we envision that we can domesticate this native plant into a perennial oilseed crop. So it's a very, very long-term project. We're doing that in collaboration with an organization called the Land Institute. And it's part of a University of Minnesota initiative called the Forever Green Initiative, which is focused around developing winter annuals and perennial crops to provide that continuous living cover on the landscape and produce a lot of those benefits that I think others today have already mentioned. And so that's part of that effort as well. I also just wanted to comment on, I really appreciate Ben's comments about the resources in terms of variety selection. I'm not going to talk a lot about variety selection, but I am glad to hear that Ben is taking advantage of the variety trial reports that we post on our website. And I'm glad that somebody's out there reading those reports. It takes us a lot of time and energy to put together all of that trial data and get it organized. And so I would encourage folks to take advantage of that as a resource. One thing that we've been trying to do, and we did this year, which was new, is to post preliminary results on our website for all of the crops: wheat, soybeans, barley, oats, with the idea that it's usually a big push to get our data organized and get it all polished into a final product, but there are at least some parts of our data that we can get up there sooner, and so we post that informally as a spreadsheet. So you've usually waited until November or December to look at the website. You might want to look earlier and find information earlier than what we typically did. So I'll start by so today's topic, I want to talk about winter barley. I want to start just by acknowledging that this is the work that I'm going to talk about has been made possible by a whole lot of people listed on this slide. I have several faculty colleagues and their staff that work very hard on different aspects of winter barley. And I'll just call out Aaron Lorenz, who is actually our soybean breeder, but as you'll hear about today, one of the goals that we're looking at is a longer term goal of getting varieties out that could be used in a double cropping system, even in Minnesota. And so our soybean breeder is very much aware of those opportunities and is thinking about how that impacts his own breeding program. And then Brian Stephenson, I'll mention, he has done a lot of work. His job is really to look at unadapted germplasm, wild relatives, to look for new genetics, new traits or genes that we can bring into our breeding program. And he's done an extensive amount of work screening germplasm for winter hardiness. And so I'll talk a lot about winter hardiness. in this presentation, since that's the main trait that we're really focusing on for winter barley. And then last, I'll call out Joachim Wiersma. And while I don't have a lot of good practical information about production and management practices, Joachim Wiersma is our small grains extension expert, and he's certainly capable of answering a lot of those kinds of questions. So I'll start out with just a little bit about why we're interested in winter barley, and Matt alluded to some of this already. I'll give you a little bit of a breeding update. So what are we doing in our breeding program? Where do I think things are going? I'll mention a new variety that we've just released. Talk a little bit about how we can improve low temperature tolerance or winter hardiness. And really it involves expanding the genetics that we're using and also looking at some interesting mechanisms, trying to understand how do plants survive cold temperatures. And then the last thing I'll talk about is an experiment that we've just started to look at how might we implement winter barley into a soybean winter barley double cropping system. All right, so why winter barley? I think a lot of this has been alluded to in talking about cover crops in general, but this is a picture that was taken on the same day on our St. Paul campus plots of a spring planted and a fall planted barley. And as you can see, you have much more lush growth in the spring, and that brings with it lots of great what we call ecosystem services, but also practical services for farmers. So you can imagine that there's a fair amount of weed suppression that happens in the fall planted crop, and we actually anecdotally observe a lot less problems with weeds coming up, and we have almost no need to do sort of a tillage, early tillage for weeds in our plots, in our fall planted plots. And then there's a lot of the other things that have been mentioned today already in terms of spreading out the operations on the farm. You don't have to worry about a late planting because the spring is too wet because your crop is in the ground already. There's a possibility of avoiding some diseases that I think are really important, and that's something that we're really interested in because small grains do have several important disease issues that we have to be concerned about. And so there's a lot of great opportunities. And the reason we really got started in winter barley was this idea that we could try to develop a cover crop that is also a cash crop. So it's a cover crop that you can actually harvest something of value from. And so that really was the driving force behind that. Another reason that winter barley has some great interest and potential is that if you look at things side by side, and it's a little difficult to do really direct comparisons side by side, winter barleys can produce much higher yields than spring barleys. Now, of course, that means they first have to survive the winter, but if they can survive the winter, there is that potential. And this is just a graph that shows you the distribution of a bunch of breeding lines in our program where we looked at the yield, and the yield is plotted on the x-axis here, and then the number of lines that attain that yield. And you can see that the fall planted barley lines had a fair amount higher yield and an average quite a bit higher yield, 137 bushels versus 92 bushels in the year that this was done. Now, the reason that we can do this direct comparison between fall planted and spring planted barleys is that my breeding program is focused on developing what are called facultative barleys. So I'll say a little bit more about facultative barleys in a few minutes, but the short answer is that facultative barleys can be planted in either the spring or in the fall. So they're winter hardy, they can survive the winter, but they don't need that cold vernalization period to flower. They will flower without it. And there's a couple of reasons why we're really interested in facultative barleys. It's much more convenient from a breeding program perspective because we can get more generations in a year. And then I think there's some really important practical implications of having the flexibility of planting in the spring or the fall. Another reason that we're interested in winter barley is that it's going to be heading and therefore harvested much earlier than a spring crop. So again, that's important when we're thinking about a double cropping system, because we know that if we the longer that we delay planting, for example, soybeans, we're going to be losing yield, and there's going to be a trade-off between, sort of that double cropping system and the potential yield loss that you would have by later planting of soybean. So we do select for earlier maturing breeding lines in our program. And then the other thing is that we can, I think it will be really important for avoiding certain diseases. So we have a number of fungal diseases that come in sort of late into the season. And if we're harvesting our winter barley, 3 weeks earlier than our spring barley, we're going to avoid some of those. All right, and then another reason, of course, the main trait that we focus on, or the main end use that we've focused on in our breeding program, since it began over 100 years ago, is for malting. And this slide is intended to just show you the sort of disparity between where the beer is being consumed and where the barley is being grown. And so you can see pretty clearly here that this region of spring barley production here is not necessarily where most of the beer is being consumed. And so again, I think other speakers have alluded to this idea of locally produced ingredients. So how do we get barley produced in the regions where it's actually going to be used? And there's a lot of interest by the malting and brewing industry in that, particularly in this really booming craft brewing industry that we're in right now. A lot of those small craft brewers really do appreciate and understand the importance of local ingredients and being able to tell that story. So, because we have such a concentrated region of spring barley, we can grow winter barley in a lot of these other regions as well. And then, we're shortening the supply chain. So even big malt companies like Rauer Malting in Shakopee, Minnesota, I work with them very closely. They're very interested in getting more production closer to their malt plant because it costs money to move that grain around. All right, so I want to just say a little bit about winter, because this is the main theme of today, is this sort of winter survival and how well does barley survive in the winter. And so I have a series of a couple of slides here that attempt to illustrate what a winter looks like in Minnesota. And so what I have is these blue diamond dots are the air temperatures, and along the x-axis is time from fall till spring. And so you can see that this pink area is our temperatures, or when the temperatures have gotten below zero, which is quite common. And my wife has been telling me on a regular basis the temperature in Minnesota while I'm here in California in the desert. So we've experienced some of these cold temperatures already this year. And then the white area on this graph is an illustration of the snow depth. And so we know that the air temperature and the snow depth are major drivers in terms of when we get good or poor winter survival with small grains. So McGregor is a feed barley, a variety that's not terribly available right now, but it's one that we've used for a long time as a check in our experiments. And this is an example of a year when we had 100% survival of McGregor. And you can see we had some cold weather for sure, but we also had this very consistent snow cover on the ground, which I believe is what was helping it survive well. Here's another year where we had quite good survival, and some of you may remember this winter. I think it was 2011 or something like that, where it seemed like we almost didn't have winter. Very, very few, only one or a couple of days where we even got below zero. Very little snow cover, but still had reasonably good survival in that kind of a winter. Then we have a winter where we had zero survival. And you can see here that we had very much less snowfall, sort of sporadic. The snow kind of melted away. And we definitely had some colder temperatures where there was no snow cover, which is really the sort of the death of winter barley. And then here's another year that's quite like that as well. And you'll notice here is the huge fluctuations in temperature. So that's another thing that is of concern when we're thinking about that. And then if you stack up a bunch of these years together, you can start to see some patterns that really get at this idea of snow cover and temperature, and the combination of those two factors deciding whether you get winter kill or not. And anecdotally, what I can say is that our own breeding program over the last 10 or 11 years, about half of the years we've had reasonably good winter survival, 100% or close to that, a good harvest. And then half of the year is pretty severe winter kill. So that's where we're at right now. It's kind of a 50-50 shot, which for most people, unless you're a gambler in Vegas, is probably not great odds. And that's what we're trying to improve upon.
Kevin, is fall soil moisture, does that impact survivability as well, or?
I'm not sure if it does directly. One of the things that does affect survivability is the planting date. And so if you plant too late and you don't get enough of plant growth happening in the fall before the cold weather sets in, that will reduce survival. And if you don't have good moisture, even if you get planted, if your crop doesn't emerge, you're going to have that, very little time to develop growth. So I would say that the soil moisture affects it in that sense.
And in terms of planting date, I know that can be kind of tricky to gauge, but we've been pretty conservative on that with even the varieties that we've had reasonably good success with wintering, even into early September.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a sense of off the cuff recommendations?
Yeah, we've done I think I'll show a graph here that shows one of the studies that we did. We actually target like October 1 for our trials in St. Paul and in southern Minnesota. Part of that's because we're a research program and we're turning stuff around, and so it's hard to get it done much sooner than that. But also we've noticed that if you do plant earlier and you get a lot of lush growth in the fall, you have the opportunity for those plants to be exposed to different pathogens. So like powdery mildew and barley yellow dwarf are things that can come in the fall. And we have noticed that some of the earlier plantings, you do get reduced winter survival. So we've tended to wait till the end of September, or like I said, even the first week of October.
Okay, thanks. That's helpful.
And it's kind of amazing. I mean, even plants that only have 2 or 3 leaves on them in the fall before the cold hits seem to have made it through winters, if everything else works. So, all right, so let's talk a little bit about some of the breeding work that we're doing. Selecting for winter survival is one of my favorite breeding traits. It's super easy to walk through the field and select the good ones and throw out the bad ones, unlike a lot of the other traits that we struggle with to try to select for. But this is kind of a typical example of what an early generation nursery would look like, where we plant out literally thousands of potential new varieties. And that first screen, we try to figure out how to ferret out the ones that are definitely not going to make it. It's kind of nice because they don't make any seeds, so they really can't make it. So it really is truly survival of the fittest. On the left, just to give you sort of a breeding timeline, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. Breeders really like to show these breeding timelines. And this just shows you that it takes about 8 or 9 years to release a variety from when you cross 2 parents and you do all of the various trials over time. And then this for malting barleys, it's a little bit longer because we have to go through, or we have been going through, this industry evaluation program where the malting brewing industries evaluate the most elite lines and decide which ones are a good fit for malting and brewing. The picture on the right shows you one of those years where very little survived. And one of my technicians is out there right now actually digging up one of the few green survivors, putting it into a pot, and took it to the greenhouse, and we made crosses with it. And actually that line is in some of the lines that is a parent of some of the breeding lines we have in our program right now. So that shows you some of the challenges that we have, because if we have a really harsh winter, we really can't do selection because everything dies. If we have a really mild winter, we can't really do selection either because everything survives. Apologize for the noise here. It's like somebody has decided to do a little work in the yard outside. So I hope that's not too distracting. It's like they're moving away. All right, so just to show you a little bit more about our breeding program, these are all the different sites that we do testing at. All of these sites we do testing at for spring trials. The ones I just highlighted in red are the locations that we'll be doing our winter trials in. So we're just getting to the point now of being able to do variety trials with winter barley. We haven't actually published data in the variety trials yet, but we'll probably start in the next couple of years. And then we got really brave this year and we decided to put a couple of locations up north just to see what might happen there.
And Kevin, you mentioned a little bit about facultative varieties. Is it go to assume that all the spring varieties are spring only? Do they have any facultative characteristics or not?
Yeah, the spring varieties we have are spring only. I mean, we have put some spring varieties checks in our fall planted trials, and I think last year we even had a few survivors in one of our spring varieties. So, I mean, a spring variety could survive a mild enough winter. But no, the spring varieties that are out there are typically do not have enough winter hardiness to survive a winter.
Gotcha. Thanks.
So, MN Equinox is a variety that we just released, and we're pretty excited about it because it's our first winter barley variety that's come out of our breeding program. It's not perfect, but it's definitely something that's quite a new thing for us, and we're pretty excited about it and the possibility of getting some winter barley acres out in Minnesota and the surrounding area. You can see some of the data here. I've color coded it with conditional formatting, so green is generally better and red is not so great. It's got good winter survival. And it has really good yield. So this is data from a fall planted trial. So we called it Minnesota Equinox because it is a facultative barley. So it is a variety that you can grow in both, or plant in both the spring and the fall. Those are pretty unusual. There are only maybe one or two other commercially available varieties I can think of right now that are facultative. So that's one of its unique properties. It's a little taller than other varieties. And it has a little bit more of an issue with stem breakage. So it's an early maturing variety. And so if you don't get out and harvest it right away, you could experience some yield loss due to stem breakage. But otherwise, it's really represents a pretty substantial first start for our winter program. And what I can say is in our pipeline, we have a lot of other sources of winter hardiness as parents. So I think we can really build on the winter hardiness as well as improving some of those other traits, in the years to come. So because it's a facultative barley, we also included in our regular spring barley trial. So these are the spring barley varieties that are kind of out there and have been in our normal varietal trial bulletin. What you can see though is that it doesn't yield particularly well when it's planted in the spring. That's because it is very early maturing. You can see its heading date. It's quite a bit earlier. Interestingly, it's quite short when it's planted in the fall. So it's a taller variety planted in the spring, taller variety planted in the fall. But when it's planted in the spring, I think because of its early maturity and responding to light photo period, it's quite a bit shorter. The other thing, I'll point out is that we're able to do, when we can spring plant our barley varieties, we can put them in our whole regiment of disease screening nurseries. And we have about 7 or 8 diseases that we screen every year. I've just put 3 of them on this particular slide. One to focus on is this DON, which is Fusarium head blight, which is the mycotoxin that was referred to earlier. And Equinox looks like it has lower levels of DON, which is a really good thing because that's a major disease issue in the Midwest. And this is in a spring planted trial. And so my guess is that the fall planted version of Equinox, which would mature even earlier, might actually escape the disease and actually end up with lower DON. Now, I don't have real data to confirm that yet, but I think that's a reasonable logical conclusion to draw from what we know about the disease in this variety. I just wanted to mention this bigger trial that we do. It's called the Winter Malting Barley Trial. It's a national trial that I coordinate with collaborators all across the US. You can see these different locations of where we grow the trial, or where my collaborators grow the trial. And the little black dots are just the mean survival for that particular state, average of their locations across the state. So you can see that winter barley has a lot of potential in a lot of the US, not so much in the regions that are really dominated by spring barley. So again, kind of back to that idea of how can we diversify agricultural systems across the landscape in a way that provides local ingredients for local industries.
Kevin, there was a question from the chat about how you evaluate stand. I don't know, is that something you're going to get into at all, or like, do you have a sense of at what stand would be worth keeping versus tearing up?
I think I do have a slide on that, but I can just say for right now, if you get 70% survival, you're probably fine, and it might even be 50%. I'll show a slide in a second that will kind of illustrate that.
Gotcha. Thanks.
All right, so maybe a little bit about mechanisms here. Just to kind of go over, this was the definitions of spring, winter, and facultative. So spring is not cold tolerant, and it doesn't require this cold period, this vernalization period to flower. A true winter type is cold tolerant, but it does require this cold period. Usually it's at least 4 to 5 weeks of cold before it will flower. And then a facultative type doesn't require that cold period. And there's very specific genetics that are well understood that control this whether or not you're a facultative or require vernalization. And those are easily manipulated in a breeding program by selecting for those specific genes. And this is just a slide. So kind of, I wanted to pick out one of those slides where these huge fluctuations, just to remind people that plants respond to the environment, right? So they're constantly sensing the environment to figure out what to do. And so this vernalization requirement is one of those ways that plants figure out how to not try to flower in the middle of winter, right? So once you begin flowering, you become very sensitive to cold temperatures, regardless of your genetic hardiness to cold temperatures. And so the problem with, having plants respond to cold as a measurement of when winter is that temperature is pretty variable across the winter. And you can get some warm temperatures where those plants might start to wake up and start to grow again, and then possibly transition into flowering, and then they're going to get killed by the next cold wave. So to guard against that, facultative barleys use a different environmental cue. They use the day length period. So plants are really genius in terms of their measurement of the calendar. They know what time of the year it is basically by day length. And so they need long day lengths usually to flower. And so we know that we're only going to have long day lengths at a time when we're going to flower. There's not going to be long day lengths in November and December and January. So there's no danger of plants flowering. So the way we're trying to package these new varieties is to have them be not require the cold tolerance vernalization period, but to definitely be day length sensitive, so that they can they'll only flower at the right time of year. Another sort of mechanism or genetic mechanism that we're thinking about in terms of how do we improve the chances of barley surviving in winter has been led by one of my colleagues, Walid Sadak, who's a physiologist. And it's really interesting work that he's done. He's looked at the xylem tissues of barley. And in particular, he's looking at these things called the metaxylem. So for those of you who can't remember your basic plant anatomy, the xylem is like the water conducting tissue. So it's the water pipes of the plant. And so if you look at these metaxylems here, this is McGregor. This is a more winter hardy variety that I mentioned earlier, and it has these relatively small metaxylem vessels. But if you look at Charles, which is a less winter hardy variety, but yet it is a winter variety, it has much larger metaxylem vessels. And it turns out that trend is true in a lot of different plant species, but it also isn't true in barley. So So Walid and his group, actually measured the metaxylem diameter, which is shown on the y-axis, and he compared it between the sensitive and the tolerant types. And it was very consistent. He looked at different leaves on the plant. He found a very consistent difference between that. So that is now one thing that we're starting to look at. I have a postdoc who is going to look at a broad range of germplasm with a much higher throughput way of measuring this metaxylem diameter to see if that's something that we could select for directly and try to improve in hardiness. All right, so I'll finish up with just the last little segment here where we think about, okay, once we have these varieties, what's going to be the most economic, profitable, ecologically sustainable way to deploy them in the landscape? And so we've sort of zeroed in on looking at this winter barley soybean cropping system as a way to do that. Part of that rationale is this is just showing you some soybean acreages from soybean and barley acreages from 1990 and from 2010. And what you see interestingly is this huge area where barley was dominant in Minnesota and North Dakota, within a 20-year period became the most popular soybean area. So soybeans and barley are kind of fighting over acreage. And my idea is, well, if we can develop a winter barley that we can double crop with soybean, we don't really need to displace soybean. We just need to share the part of the year that soybean typically isn't growing in this sort of double crop system. The other reason is we're very interested, and this is again part of this Forever Green initiative, main drivers is to look at ways to reduce nitrate leaching from our agricultural lands. And this is just an experiment that was done not with winter barley, but with a couple of other crops, winter annual crops that are part of this Forever Green initiative. And this is measuring leachates in the spring from a couple of different treatments. So they had a clean tilled system. They had a no-till stubble system without a winter crop. And then they had radish, rye, pennycress, and camelina. And you can see very clearly that having this cover crop on the landscape significantly reduced the amount of nitrate leakage from that system. And so there's no reason to think that barley wouldn't be able to do something similar to these other winter annuals. And again, we're in the process of trying to collect that data. I guess this is that slide that kind of got buried in there for planting date. So I'll kind of just cover it very quickly, but there's 3 varieties. And you can see that we planted, in this case, even October 11th in that year, and we got reasonably really good survival. But if we planted too soon, we observed lower winter survival. Same sort of pattern that you would expect with yield. So again, for at least southern Minnesota, I think the end of September or even waiting till the 1st of October is probably okay. So when we think about a double cropping system, this is a little cartoon to sort of help me think about it. This is the single crop version of just having soybean. If we add barley into the mix, we can try to do this sort of relay cropping. And I have a number of colleagues that are working on different kinds of relay cropping systems where you plant the soybeans into the barley before you actually harvest the barley to give it a head start so you don't shorten the growing season too much. So we opted to just go with a standard double crop system where you wait until the barley is harvested before you plant the soybeans, simply because we think, at least early on, that's going to be easier for farmers to implement. And if we get relay systems to work, it just will make the system even better. But these numbers here along the bottom are just to remind me that, if you plant by May 1, you can expect to get about 100% of what you would normally get for your soybean crop. But if you wait until July 1, your yields may be 50% of what you would get the normal planting date. So there is this cost associated with this system, but the hope would be that even a 50% yield of soybeans, along with a full winter barley, malting barley premium crop, would be a very profitable system for farmers that uses this continuous cover landscape. So this is the experiment we have set up, and I don't have any data to show, but I'll just let you know that we have an experiment where we're doing soybean alone and soybean plus winter barley. We have a tillage treatment in there as well. We're doing it on both conventional and organic sites at St. Paul and Lamberton, and then we'll be measuring the yield, obviously the quality of both the soybean and barley coming off, and we'll be also measuring nitrate leakage soil organic matter as well. So we're excited about that experiment to see, to see where that might go. And again, sort of how these varieties get implemented into a system. So I'll just, before I open up for any questions, if we have time or people are interested in questions, I think I'm really excited about winter barley. I'm also cautious about it because I want people to go into this with their eyes wide open. We've got a new variety out there; it's ready to go. But historically, we have had this issue of, some years we get complete winter kill. So that's always a possibility. But I think I'm really excited about the way that winter barley, as part of these agricultural systems, might provide some of these ecosystem services. I spent a lot of time talking to my industry colleagues about ways where they can provide the economic pull for this sort of system to help mitigate that risk, because even the large brewers, but definitely the small brewers, are interested in locally produced grains, and also grains that are produced in a more sustainable way that add to that story that they can tell about their product. So I think that's something that's I've seen it already become more and more important on the industry side, and I hope that will continue. And then I'm pretty excited also about our continued progress that we'll be able to make in improving winter hardiness and hopefully reducing the risk associated with trying to grow this new crop in the upper Midwest. So I will stop there, and we'll have questions.
Awesome.
I did run a little long, but I wasn't paying too close attention to the time.
No, it's all good. We were about 10 minutes off schedule, so you're doing just fine. I really appreciate the time and sharing your expertise and your presentation with us. We really appreciate it. And in full disclosure, we're producing seed stock of MN Equinox this spring, kind of taking advantage of some of its facultative characteristics, and then hope to have it available this fall for planting as well. So are there, to that point, if you do take advantage of the facultative characteristics and say plant it in the spring, does that make the plant revert to more of a spring type, or does it still carry both of those characteristics? Like if you harvested the seed from a spring planted, could you then turn around and plant it in the winter?
Yeah, you certainly could do that. I'm trying to think. I mean, we have looked at various characteristics of grain harvested from both spring and fall planted trials. And in terms of like malting characteristics and stuff, those seem to be the same. And we have ourselves turned around and harvested a spring planted crop and then used that as a seed source for fall. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Gotcha. And there was a question about yes, winter barley versus spring barley for malting, and certainly both could be used for malting. Currently, there's winter barleys grown like in Indiana, Illinois, Ohio that go to the malting industry, as well as spring varieties that go to the malting industry too.
That is true. It's dominated by spring varieties. So the vast majority of barley used is going to be spring barley, but there are certain regions where, and it's usually the smaller brewers right now that are using some winter barleys in warmer climates. Mm-hmm. But even the larger brewers are quite interested in winter barley. They ask me lots of questions about varieties and things like that.
What do you feel like the range is for a variety like Equinox? How far south can it go? Or
yeah, that's a good question. So we have had it in this winter malting barley trial. In all these different locations, and it definitely doesn't yield as well as some of the other lines in the warmer regions. So the yields are going to be less competitive with some of the other varieties when you get down into like we have trials in North Carolina and Virginia and places like that. So that might be, again, but there's not too many varieties to choose from these days, right? So there's only a couple of public programs that are developing varieties, and then the other varieties that we test actually are coming from Europe. So they were developed for Europe, and they're just trying them out here to see if they, how well they'll do here. Mm-hmm. But I mean, I think, the good thing about Equinox is it has, the stem rust resistance and some of the other disease resistances that would be that you would expect to be a problem maybe in the Midwest and further south. So that's a good thing. But because of its early maturity, it will probably yield less than some of the other ones. But again, that's what makes it more attractive as in a double cropping system.
Is there a critical temperature in the fall in which you see more mortality from winter barley, or is it kind of that fluctuation that impacts it more, or is it both? Or
yeah, that's a great question. I have a postdoc now who's trying to collect all sorts of weather data from a much broader range. So we're using this winter malting barley trial, which we've run for 11 years now, in 20 or 30 locations per year. It's a huge data set to sort of ask that question, like what is the risk? How can we predict the risk in a certain region? So I'm hopeful that in the next year or so, we'll get together a sort of a prediction model and be able to sort of produce a map that says, okay, here's the risk level you can expect in these different regions. Anecdotally, what I would say though is that if you have temperatures that have dropped to, into the lower teens Fahrenheit without any snow cover for more than a couple of days, that's probably going to be a bad thing. What I've typically observed is we have these cold fronts move through, and a lot of times you get a snow in front of it and then the temperature drops off, and that seems to be just fine. But if you get one of these dry cold fronts that moves through where the temperature drops down to 0 or below 0 and there's no snow on the ground, then that's pretty tough.
Gotcha. And then this is kind of an interesting question in the chat. Some people might be familiar with winter triticale as a cross between winter wheat and winter rye. Are winter rye and barley compatible at all from a breeding standpoint, or not?
I think people have tried to make those sorts of crosses. It's really difficult to make those interspecific crosses and get things that not only survive, but then that are genetically stable. Because barley is a diploid, it makes it even harder to make those crosses between a polyploid and a diploid. So I can't say that it hasn't been done, but it's not something that's being actively pursued.
Gotcha.
It'd be great to have some of that winter hardiness from rye, that's for sure.
Yeah, no kidding. That's one thing that, we, as I've worked at the seed house for more and more years, we've and this is obviously common knowledge to a lot of people that have been farming for generations, but it's our planting recommendations for winter rye keep moving farther and farther back. It's just one of those crops that is very well adapted to our climate for winter hardiness.
Yeah, it's one of our controls we always plant. And also in terms of looking at some of these morphological features of plants, we're also looking at rye and wheat and other things, including barley. So we're hoping to get some clues from that as well.